One thing that surprises me these days is that with everything we know about Marxism, how is it that this ideology keeps seeping into our society? After World War II, the West battled it out with the Soviet Union in a war of political influence. With the fall of Europe, the rebuilding had begun. The Allied forces made their way to Berlin through the Western countries, while at the same time the Soviets were conquering the east side of Europe, until they both merged at Berlin. With Hitler and the Nazi Party destroyed, Europe was ripe for the taking. The Soviets, who at one point signed a non-aggression pact with the Germans, at first had sympathies for the Nazis since both of them were anti-capitalist. After Germany betrayed them, the Soviets begrudgingly allied themselves with the British Commonwealth and the Allied forces. When the war ended, the Soviets once again turned its eye against Western influence. They had many broken European countries under their control, and they were consumed into the Greater Soviet Union. America, in turn, built up Japan and Western Germany and supported the Western European countries, leading to the Cold War. The Soviets were seen as such a danger to the West, even during World War II, that Winston Churchill had concocted a plan to invade the USSR soon after the defeat of Germany, which would have effectively started World War III just weeks or months after the Second World War had ended. This plan was called Operation Unthinkable. Churchill was worried because the Russians had a lot of troops stationed in eastern Germany. Despite the fact the Soviets were lacking in equipment, they had endless supplies of young men to sacrifice themselves for the motherland. Churchill devised a plan to invade the Soviets and destroy them as a threat to Western influence. Churchill only abandoned the plan when the prospects of the invasion looked bleak. Operation Unthinkable was then turned into a defensive strategy in case the Soviets invaded Western Europe. Throughout the next few decades, the American and Soviet Union squared off, fighting proxy wars in the Middle East. Espionage and propaganda was everywhere. Eventually, the atrocities involved with communism came to light. All of the Western academics who were advocating for communism quickly changed their tune. Those who didn't kept their beliefs quiet. Ironically, American communists at the time called themselves progressives. Some things never change. Despite the mass killing, the gulags, the economic disaster, the famine, and the draconian secret police, people still hold firm to the idea of Marxism, whether that be communism, socialism, or some other form. A century of bloody communism and the death of more than 200 million people throughout the 20th century wasn't enough to disillusion some from the idea. They could only repeat the same factually untrue phrase. But that wasn't real communism. That's a phrase which has been long used by the apologists as a way to minimize the impact of this terrible political and cultural philosophy. Karl Marx was a lazy, immoral man who wanted to live off the labor of others. He blamed others for his problems. This saying, "it's not real communism," has seeped into the culture so much that the people will reiterate this phrase more as a talking point rather than having put much thought into the statement. I have heard people who don't believe in communism repeat these words. Why am I specifically talking about communism? Just about every form of socialism can be traced back to Marxism. While not the originator of communism, Marx's philosophies definitely influenced the movement. The left versus right-wing politics is a necessary part of our culture. The left creates, the right manages. The left pushes for more equality and fairness, the right pushes for more responsibilities and freedom. This back and forth keeps society moving forward and keeps the inequality from getting out of control. Too much inequality and the population grows angry. Too much equality, society's traditions get eroded and the government grows larger. The problem arose when left-wing America went too far. The center-left abandoned their platforms and jumped in bed with the fringe left, the socialist left, the SJW left. They abandoned any and all principles of liberalism, but refused to abandon the name, instead using this label as a cover to implement their far-left ideologies. As their numbers and influence grew, the Marxists began to abandon this cover label of liberalism and the extreme left were the first to dictate that liberals get the bullet too. With the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and other key nations around the world, Marxism needed a rebranding. It could not come in as a political and economic platform in the West, which at the time would be considered political suicide. So the Marxists, a term encompassing those who follow the teachings of Karl Marx, such as the multiple communist offshoots such as Maoism and Trotskyism, the Socialists, and the Social Democrats. These groups came together, despite their many differences and conflicts, to fight back against their mutual enemy, capitalism and the West. They decided instead to focus on the society as a whole and change the culture from key strategic positions. Yuri Bezmenov was an ex-KGB informant who defected to Canada. During his time in Canada, he went in depth about his experience living under the Soviet Union. He explained that the USSR had infiltrated the US with the plans to subvert American society. They would get into positions of power and change the culture from the inside out.
Of the KGB or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see, most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
This new threat, this rebranding, is known as cultural Marxism, but also goes by postmodernism. And the goal is to achieve a socialist society by changing the political views of the population through well-placed propaganda. This is why they targeted the universities and the entertainment industries first, completely subjugating them to their will. Dissenting voices in these communities are rare, and generally come from veterans of the industry who come from an older time. What is cultural Marxism?
I don't think that you can understand the current situation properly without considering the role that postmodernism plays in this, because postmodernism, in many ways, especially as it's played out politically, is the new skin that the old Marxism now inhabits. So you could think that there's a postmodern philosophy, which we'll talk about a bit, that really came into its vogue in the 1970s after classic Marxism, especially of the economic type, had been so thoroughly discredited that no one but an absolute reprobate could support it publicly anymore. Even the French intellectuals had to admit that communism was a bad deal by the end of the 1960s. And what happened was that they played a sleight of hand game in some sense and rebranded themselves under the postmodern guise. And that's where identity politics came from. And so And then that spread like wildfire from France, especially into the US, through Yale University, through the English department there, and then everywhere. And so what happened was, you know, there was this idea that the Marxists had put forth that the natural landscape of economic landscape is a battle. And it's a battle between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeois. And that that economic systems were doomed to continue to enslave people and to keep them poor and downtrodden unless there was a radical economic transformation that was predicated on something more like equity policy. And then that was put into place in many, many places, as you no doubt know, throughout the 20th century, with absolutely murderous results. It was the most destructive economic and political doctrine, I think, that has ever been invented by mankind, and that includes National Socialism, because the absolute magnitude of the havoc wreaked by the communist systems exceeded that wreaked by Hitler. And that's, I mean, Hitler didn't have quite as long a time to pull his stunts off quite as effectively, but it was a catastrophic system. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that the full breadth of that catastrophe is not something that students are well taught in our current educational system, which has always made me very suspicious. For example, the students I teach usually know nothing at all about what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin between, say, Stalin and Lenin between 1919 and 1959. They have no idea that millions, tens of millions of people were killed and far more tortured and brutalized by that particular regime, to say nothing of Mao.
What is cultural Marxism? I have found a few descriptions from multiple sources. The first comes from the Daily Caller, from an article called Cultural Marxism is Destroying America, written on the 29th of September 2006 by Moses Apostaticus, that states, "Cultural Marxism is the Marxism dialectic fused with Freudian theory and applied to identity and culture. Like all forms of Marxism, it is based upon categorizing people with an abstract group and then creating a narrative of historical oppression between them. The strategy of Marxists is always to cultivate a victimized group and then convince its members that solidarity is required against the oppressor. This creates resentment and hatred and is how Marxist ideologies fulfill their revolutionary objectives." Cultural Marxism refers to a school or offshoot of Marxism that conceives of culture as central to the legitimate of oppression, in addition to the economic factors that Karl Marx emphasized. An outgrowth of Western Marxism and finding popularity in the 1960s as cultural studies, cultural Marxism argues that what appears as traditional culture phenomena intrinsic to Western society, for instance the drive for individual acquisition associated with capitalism, nationalism, the nuclear family, gender roles, race, and other forms of cultural identity. To sum it up, cultural Marxism is a rebrand of Marxist theory under the disguise of political correctness, social justice, intersectional feminism, and postmodernism, but new terms arise every day. They just change the focus from economics to society. It is an application of critical theory that is used as a weapon in order to tear down the values and traditions of the West. The Marxist plan was simple, effective, but a long-term game. Infiltrate an organization, work your way to the top, then begin enacting changes from the inside out, the top down. If this is unachievable, then infiltrate the organization and befriend those at the bottom. Pretend to agree while slowly and steadily pulling in others that have the same beliefs and ideologies as yourself. Create a commotion about the changes you want, and the vocal minority will appear to speak for the silent majority, and the detractors will appear as a small fringe group that can be easily dismissed through slanderous methods such as calling them sexist or racist. A good example of this is Anita Sarkeesian, who is an online feminist personality. When she got involved in gaming years ago, she gave a talk to a group of women where she almost explicitly said that this is what she was doing. She said she didn't know much about video games and that she had to learn when she jumped into them. She then went on to talk about how the sexist, misogynistic culture of video gaming, despite the fact that she had next to no idea about gamers and the attitudes surrounding the environment. A simple plan. Effective too. Don't agree? Take a look around. How many industries have suddenly in the last few years gone left-wing political? Remember when Super Bowl ads were funny? Remember when Marvel characters didn't shove a narrative down your throat and was about mindless violence and entertainment? How has it gotten this far? The social justice warriors don't speak for the majority, yet they are the ones who are constantly getting recognized by the mainstream or end up in roles of power. This is the plan of the cultural Marxists. Who are these cultural Marxists? They're easy to find, and you often don't have to look too hard. Justin Trudeau and many, if not all, of his cabinet members are Marxists. His father was a Marxist. Globalism is a common term used these days, and this definition fits in perfectly for the Marxists. You can recognize them because their concerns are primarily focused on the larger global stage rather than their constituency and citizens. They focus on the minority groups inside the society. They send massive amounts of money abroad for many various reasons. Many have very little to do with trade, but are actually donations, such as when Trudeau gave $20 million to the Clinton Foundation for gender advancement and research. They have a focus on massive immigration and for destroying any idea of nationality or identity. They claim to be against classes when they are in fact carving out their place in the social hierarchy. This will allow them to divide and conquer with much greater ease. This is the Marxist Plan. This is the way they gain control in countries that are firmly opposed to their ideologies, such as America. It is the frog in the boiling water example. The Marxists slowly turn up the heat, so people notice, but soon get used to the talking points or the reactions. When the population has grown accustomed to the situation, they turn up the heat a little more, focusing their attention on their next target. This plan is well strategized. The Marxists don't jump into any field. They pick and choose which ones will cause the greatest cultural impact, with a specific interest in younger, more impressionable generations. This is why one of the first targets of the Marxists was academia. Since the university's job is to teach, influence, and challenge young minds, it was the perfect place to start. They could enter and teach this subject matter under the disguise contrary viewpoints to the mainstream opinion at the time: the nuclear family, religion, nationality, and capitalist system. Men's social and moral relations would be seriously modified by this gain of economical freedom, and by the lapse of superstition, moral and other, which necessarily accompany a state of economical slavery. The test of duty would now rest on the fulfillment of clear and well-defined obligations to the community rather than on the molding of the individual character and the actions to some preconceived standard outside social responsibilities. Education freed from the trammels of commercialism on the one hand and superstition on the other would become a reasonable drawing out of men's varied faculties in order to fit them for a life of social intercourse and happiness. For mere work would no longer be proposed as the end of life, but happiness for each and all. The Manifesto of the Socialist League by William Morris and E. Belford Bax. From their position as professors, the Marxists taught a new generation on the inequalities of the West, the oppressive 1%, the Marxist philosophy under the banner of gender and cultural studies. One of the best ways to influence people was to focus on the female demographic, co-opting the feminist movement to push the equity and patriarchal society narratives. As the years went on, those professors moved their way up the corporate ladder and came into positions of authority where they could begin to making real change. Now, they could completely change the environment. They enacted changes in the rules and regulations of the schools, the acceptable behaviors, and usurped the power of teaching away from the teachers and towards the school boards. They had completely taken over the universities. This was known as the Long March through the institutions. The plan was exactly this. Take over the American academia and other key professions was essential to subvert the culture. This strategy can be seen almost anywhere they sink their hands into. I mentioned earlier Marvel Comics. Marvel is one of the most well-known and well-loved comic companies of all time. From Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Daredevil, X-Men, Deadpool, and many more, they produce countless classics. even if many were ripoffs. But over the last decade, they have had the Marxists infect their ranks and begin writing the scripts. At first, the changes were small, such as introducing more gay-friendly themes or gay characters, as well as creating more diverse character lists. Then, it took a serious turn. Thor was turned into a female character, Spider-Man's Peter Parker was killed off in favor of a Hispanic character to take up that role, and Captain America became a Nazi. Many other changes were made, including some cringeworthy dialogue. The readers were not happy, and the sales dropped. Many of their longtime core audiences abandoned Marvel, and even some of their veteran writers and cartoonists abandoned this sinking ship for DC Comics. This is how you can tell the Marxists are not in tune with what the people want, but that does not matter. They are not there to appease the reader. They are there to influence the reader. Those fans that stay on will have this propaganda shoved down their throat with every new comic that is released. Why do this? It is the Marxist Plan. The Marxists are aware of the influence that platforms such as television have on the people. Advertisements are proof of that. Subliminal messaging is key to many ads. A Wendy's commercial wants to make you hungry. A social justice TV program is trying to influence your thought process. This is outlined by Herbert Marcuse, who was a Marxist activist in the 1960s. He is credited by many as the primary theorist of the New Left, a movement that took place during the 1960s and 70s. He says in one of his public works, "One-dimensional thought is systemically promoted by the makers of politics and their purveyors of mass information. Their universe of discord is populated by self-validating hypotheses, which, insistently and monopolistically repeated, becomes hypnotic definitions of dictations. One-dimensional man studies in the ideology of advanced industrial society." Herbert Marcuse understood the impact that entertainment had on people, that through comedy or tragedy, they could shape people's mind to believe what they wanted them to believe. The Marxists were some of the first to take control of entertainment and turn it into a propaganda tool. This was used by the Soviets, the Chinese, and to this day is used by the North Korean government. When we look at the type of shows that are around these days, and you keep these facts in mind, then the larger picture begins to reveal itself. Why are late-night shows so bound on pushing a left-wing narrative? Why are all the shows these days dominated with feminist characters? Why are the celebrities so pushy with their beliefs? It's because the takeover of these industries is complete. The industries have vetted their ranks so well and have surrounded themselves in an echo chamber so soundly that any right-wing figures in these industries are almost insignificant. They are drowned out by the mob of lefties that surround them. This is the real fundamental fight that arose in the era of fake news. The Marxists had a firm hold on the media, but still had resistance from a few right-leaning sources such as Fox News. When Trump came into the picture and called out the mainstream media, the SJWs and the Marxists had been caught in the final stages of their takeover, and the spotlight was on them now. They had two choices: give up the territory gained or double down. They chose the latter. They ramped up the attacks and emphasized their politics harder and harder. Deception is a key part of the Marxist influence. The Marxists understand two things. First, that they could not come in offering fundamental change and be accepted. And the second, that they could use the Western freedoms to undermine the system and then destroy the same means to others. Let's take freedom of speech as an example. The Marxists use their freedom of speech to advocate for their cause. They do this in small doses, slowly influencing the people without them knowing. This is much easier to do if you are in an echo chamber, which they create. They do this both in person and through these entertainment platforms. Once they start turning the population in support of them, they can then start tearing down these freedoms under the same banner. Suddenly, under the name of equality, you cannot speak about certain subjects because it is considered hate speech. When the pushback comes, the Marxists use this as an excuse to enact hate speech laws. An example of this is Justin Trudeau recently threatened to censor Facebook. He claimed he was doing so to combat fake news. Yet Facebook and other social media platforms are the main platforms for the anti-Trudeau resistance. Trudeau's move was disguised as protection, but is in fact an attack on his detractors and another way of gaining control of the cultural opinion. The main point is to brainwash as many people as possible with this ideology. The majority of people have been indoctrinated to these beliefs and therefore are unaware of the sinister nature behind Marxism. They hear the talks of equality and fairness and spread the message. However, those that choose to spread this ideology through the means of indoctrination, such as the members of the school boards and other positions of power, they are aware of the tactics used and are actively using the Marxist Plan and the Communist Manifesto to indoctrinate others to their cause. I would like to point everyone to the tactics used by Antifa. Antifa is drowning in cultural Marxism and see violence as an acceptable means to an end. Steven Crowder did a great expose on Antifa, in which his co-host Not Gay Jared went undercover and spoke to several Antifa members. During his first in-person conversation, he was encouraged to carry a knife, and the members spoke of firearms they were trying to obtain. These members are aware of the Marxist Plan and are actively working to carry it out. Another tactic of the Marxists is to actively campaign against inequality while at the same time pushing a divisive narrative. While the left claims to be against sexism and racism, they are obsessed with the subject. They cannot let it go. This is because they require this to be true. They require the inequalities to exist, or most, if not all, of the left platform is completely destroyed. But as long as the myth of inequality survives, it allows the Marxists to enact their platform in multiple ways. This can include cultural change, legislative changes, and economic changes. Before you know it, you are living in a completely socialist society. Finally, the Marxist plans always come with increased immigration. This is to help spread the image of leftist tolerance, but more importantly, many people from the areas that they are looking to import will either come in requiring government assistance, therefore voting for larger government, or they will come in from an area that has heavy left-wing influences and will dump these people into political ridings in order to change the population demographics from right-wing to left-wing, or at the very best, weakening the right-wing party's hold in that selective riding. The demographics also help to erode the idea of patriotism. The Marxist Plan has been incredibly successful. The changes to our society over the last few years has been incredible. Yuri Bezmenov said in this 1984 interview that America was already through the demoralization process. The next step was to teach the new generation this information who will go forward and truly spread the message. My generation, the millennials. We were the targets for this indoctrination process, and now they want our children. Ontario's provincial government has already begun adding this propaganda to their education curriculum. We will continue to fight back and resist these people, but we need to move quickly. We need to take back the universities immediately. Many professors have already taken up this fight, such as Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, and Rick Mehta. But they are outnumbered and outgunned. We the people, we the students, must fight uphill. But we can do it. The left is a movement based on emotion, despite the fact they want to believe it is a scientific movement. Because it is based on emotion, it is easy to defeat them in a debate, meaning that they must appeal to terms such as bigot, Nazi, fascist. We must also take back the entertainment industry. This, too, is already underway. Right-wing YouTube is so popular at the moment that YouTube is actively censoring both large and small channels alike. We are, however, making progress. Mainstream news is dying. Late-night TV shows are dying. We must keep the pressure up. Not only America, but many countries in the rest of the world are making the swing back to the right. Canada is changing too. If we can keep moving in this direction, then we have a chance of winning our countries back. But as long as the rest of the people continue to ignore the problem, then we continue to march off the cliff.